Hi, this is Paul. If you're been following the channel, you know that I've been reading this book, and this book has been super interesting to me because I'm basically reading. There was a there was an article that Nick Waltersdorf did, and he was complaining about that synods 2022 to 2024 put him into CRC. He couldn't recognize from it was different from the CRC it was reared in. We've talked about that in CRC circles a lot, and so it got me thinking about the CRC that my grandparents were reared in. And so I've been reading about Henry J. Kuiper, who was a tremendously influential leader in the Christian Reformed Church at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, this is going to intersect with a lot of different threads, and I wrote a pretty decent sized thing on Voices about this today. So I thought I'd do some reading of that and some commenting on it. I just threw it up on my blog. It's terribly formatted, but again, it's I'm 90 pages into this book and really enjoying it. The first impression is the biggest change in the last 100 years in the Christian Reformed Church. I think this will be true among probably any other anybody. If your parents grew up in a serious religious household, my guess is many of these changes would be true for them too. The biggest change over the last 100 years in the Christian Reformed Church is the power to compel certain standards of behaviors within churches. That's what churches did. They compelled behavior. The married but not made profession of faith. So one of the things that H.J. Kuiper, he started out as a local church pastor and eventually morphed into sort of the leader of the Banner, the editor of the Banner, and we'll talk about that as we get into the story. But he started as a local church pastor, and he was sort of at this point in the Christian Reformed Church, they didn't really have a lot of the turn of the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, the 19th to 20th century, they didn't have a lot of the formal institutions. And so the church was just sort of raising its young. And so he was somebody who showed aptitude. And so they were giving him a theological education. And he was sort of raised in the Grand Rapids area and growing up in that, as many were. Did I get that right? Was it Grand Rapids? Anyway, he gets into his first churches, and as usual in the Christian Reformed Church, and this is even still true today, your starter church is usually a rural church, and you sort of move towards the city as you go. And many people in the Christian Reformed Church, the ladder of hierarchy for Christian Reformed ministers sort of moves towards West Michigan in the Grand Rapids area. That's where the biggest concentration of the immigrant colony is. But he had these practices. He was always interested in liturgy and songs. And one of the things that he did in almost all of his churches, he had a mandatory class for married people who hadn't made profession of faith. Well, what does that mean? It means that they weren't really adults in the church, but they were married. They're probably married because, of course, sex was super risky without reliable contraception, and so there's a lot of pressure to get married young, but then they would be married and in the church, but they wouldn't yet be adults in the church. So it was mandatory class. And what's amazing today, and that in so many of our churches, if you would have a mandatory class, it would have to be mandatory in order to be attached to some goal that you had. Let's say, become a member. Why do you want to become a member? I don't know. In fact, many people come into churches today, and they don't even want to be members. They just want to attend and get what they want from it and leave. Maybe they decide at some point that they want to be an office bearer or a leader in that church. Well, then you got to become a member. And, well, I'll tell you, it's all over the map because I work in an area that is predominant, a lot of African Americans. For them, they come to a church one day and they just stand up and say, I want to be a member. And then you're just a member by standing up and saying it. Of course, in Orthodoxy, you have all this long catechesis process. The Christian Reformed Church is sort of somewhere in between. But so they had all these people who were baptized, and you get into this half covenant thing, and you can Google that. The Puritans dealt with that. But mandatory classes. And it's like, if you don't go to these mandatory classes, you're going to get under discipline. And mandatory classes, go to a theater or a movie. I just finished that video about Justin Wells and Paul Anleitner. Part of the reason that the churches were so cautious about theater and movies, I don't think they certainly didn't have the cognitive science to put this together, but they just saw that these stories were powerful. And they had all sorts of other reasons why theater and movies were bad, because the actors are fundamentally lying. And these ideas go back a long, long ways. But they were very, very cautious of it. So, if you're a member in good standing in the Christian Reformed Church, you don't go to plays and you don't go to movies. And of course, they had worldly amusements then. That was one of the big issues in the 1920s. No card playing, because then you're inciting the imagination of chance instead of God's providence. And so, but these churches were serious places of serious discipline. I mean, you step out of line, the elders would come down. I mean, today you put that in, I never saw The Handwives' Tale or what have you, but 100 years ago, this was normal. This was very normal. And of course, all these evangelical diaries are about all of the tyranny that happened in churches. And just basically the assumption in our world now is, I am free and get to do what I want for the most part. And if you tell me no, I'm out of here, and too bad for you. And how dare you not let me join or have access to wherever I want to go or whatever I want to do. How could you be so tyrannical as to not let me just walk into church and be the pastor one day just because I think I should and want to be? So elders are making regular house calls, checking up on people. It doesn't mean that people liked it or people didn't leave. They did. You've got all kinds of stories of people leaving. But overall, the churches seem to grow. And again, this sort of fulfills the pattern that you see today. It's usually hardline churches have an easier time growing than sort of fuzzy churches. Where did they go? Many went to the Reformed Church in America. I remember a story my uncle told me of a family where a young woman was pregnant out of wedlock. So she stopped attending church because she knows she's going to get into trouble. But then the elders come calling because you're not attending church. The mother sort of meets him at the door and says, we joined the RCA. Okay, well, no more elder visits. It was at least that voluntary. They weren't really going to the RCA. They didn't go anywhere. They just stopped going to church. But they knew that would get the elders to stop calling. Now you can use this as you will, but this was the Christian Reformed Church. Changes happened over the years and unevenly in different places. But this was the way, disciplined according to the standards of the leaders, and different leaders in places had different standards and for some different things. And, even when I was growing up in the Christian Reformed Church in the 60s and 70s, and now I was growing up really on the fringe of the Christian Reformed Church in a chapel that became an organized congregation, but it was very different from the majority of the Christian Reformed Church. And it was always, the chapels were sort of the experimental wing, the missional wing of the Christian Reformed churches, and the rules were always looser in chapels, and everybody sort of understood that. But if you were in a real Christian Reformed church, there were rules about Sabbath keeping, and there were rules about movie attendance, and of course the Sound of Music sort of was the camel's nose in the tent that these Dutch immigrants could not say no to Julie Andrews and The Sound of Music and, being bad on Nazis. And so, that's boomerality just coming right into the Christian Reformed Church. DeYoung's bio shows, that's this book, shows first what Kuyper's discipline, that Kuyper's program was as a local pastor. Catechesis for the children and the unmarried, discipline for families, doctrinal preaching, warnings against worldliness. A lot of old CRC books floating around in used book sales. And so I just picked up a part of his 10 Commandments series. He also was big into liturgical reform in music. One of the big efforts was we're going to have a standard liturgy. Now, this is important when I get into, gosh, how much time is all this going to take? Everything was supposed to be uniform, and they had like the synodical effort to programize all of the churches on down, and it was a complete failure. The churches just revolted and wouldn't have it. And so it seemed like a complete loss for H.J. Kuyper and the people who thought like him. But eventually, they got their way. And they didn't get it through tyranny. They got it through giving people tools that sort of led them into the ways that they thought they should go. He always did a lot of work on synodical committees and local efforts at other missions and Christian schoolwork. He was a workaholic that worked himself sick on a number of occasions, taking on too many tasks at a time. The last church he had was Neeland Avenue. And for even those of you who know nothing of the Christian Reformed Church, I say Neeland Avenue, you're like, oh yeah, that's the church that ordained a woman in a same-sex relationship that started the firestorm that lit the match of Synod 2022 and led to these 3 synods that changed the world in the Christian Reformed Church. Yeah, the same church. Neyland Avenue was this church where college professors and seminary professors went, and finally that was the last stop in terms of H.J. culture's rise up the status hierarchy in the Christian Reformed Church to Neyland Avenue. And he was at that point he was their pastor there, and he was the editor of the Banner at the same time, and it basically, wrecked his health, and he eventually had to choose and became Banner editor. Banner was the English language alternative to the Dutch magazine. You really see that sense before the First World War that the CRC is a Dutch church in language and ethos. And again, they were immigrants, and they were just holding on to themselves and by having all these strong walls. But of course, at that point, America was full of all these little immigrant enclaves, all sort of trying to hang on to the world. English was a novelty and in many respects an accommodation, even though increasingly by the 1920s. So my grandfather is making his way through his education in the 1920s. And they were both born, around the turn of the century. And so both grew up in southeast Grand Rapids. My grandfather had to move there because his mother had died. They were living in Spring Lake, Michigan. His mother had died in giving birth to the youngest child, and so they moved to the city, and my grandfather and grandmother met in that southeast side. Holland, Kalamazoo, went to Oakdale Park Christian Reformed Church. But they were both completely fluent in Dutch because in those younger years, Dutch was the language of the community. And it was in the First World War that a lot of that began to change because there was so much anti-German sentiment in America that people couldn't differentiate the Deutsch from Dutch, and so suddenly Christian Reformed churches start putting up a bunch of flags and trying to have the service in English. But of course, there was a new wave of immigration after the Second World War that reinvigorated Dutch in some communities, on and on and on. The size of the CRC, when it was finally producing children in America, grew biologically and through immigration up to the First World War. You see enormous rates of growth. And what you see is, well, I'll get into it more. The report of the publication committee, this is a direct quote from the book, in 1944 Synod noted that in 1917, the Banner had 33,275 subscribers. So, that was my YouTube channel back in 2018, 2019. 11,000 when Kuiper took over in 1929. So from 1917 to 1929, in a 12-year period, the Banner nearly quadrupled. And this wasn't, the Banner was just kind of a project out there. It had some denominational ties, but everything with the denomination was quite informal. It was very small. But it nearly quadrupled of the English language readership. Now, there was a Dutch, I'm not going to try and say it because I'll massacre the word. There was a Dutch magazine that in some ways it was competing with, and eventually the Banner supplants it. And so then, a 12-year period, it quadruples in size, and in 1944, another 15-year period, it triples in size again, nearly. And so you just see this exponential growth. And this is because, of course, a lot of the immigration was in the 1890s or 1900s. And then once these people hit America, I think they were probably starving in the old world. Once they came into America and they started farming, and the farming was lousy. Or my grandparents in New England, when they were working in machine shops and some were doing farming. Once you had better nutrition, the family sizes just ballooned. And of course, 10 years and a kid, they're going to have to learn some English. But they're starting day schools, and the day schools are probably doing a lot in Dutch anyway, because the parents, there's Dutch in the home and Dutch in the schools and Dutch in the churches. But if you're living out in the society, you're going to have to learn English. And so you see this dramatic growth of the English language. And I think it was his second or third church. That was like the first church in Chicago. I've got a book on the CRC history in Chicago, which I've got to read along with many other books. Where, suddenly they're playing around with, here's an English language church. But the culture of the English language church, that was one of his most difficult congregations because they're all immersed in worldliness. The negative criticism of several Kuyper's pet projects was increasing, and the staff differences had intensified. The load was crushing, and he was crumpling, and so basically has a breakdown, and they have to figure out how to, you got to give him some more support or let some things off, but he was so driven he didn't want to let anything go. The years between the wars brought dramatic change in the CRC. It was growing. It was spreading out. Its institutions that would define it for the 20th century were being formed in that period. The same interests that compelled Kuyper as a local pastor were brought to the denomination as a whole. An early attempt to use synodical power at uniform, compelling liturgy in the 1920s failed dramatically. They got the stuff pushed through synod, but it unraveled as churches rebelled and protested. It was all dismantled as mandates, but much of it became practice over time as new tools and publications were produced which provoked the intended changes, now voluntary. H.J. Kuyper was a strange conservative. And again, people look at him today and say, well, he was such a conservative. He was a tyrannical. He was authoritarian. Probably. According to that age, he was just sort of normal. Us looking back on him today, yeah, that's what it is. He was always warning against Americanization, and his efforts to protect and guide the church brought it into the 20th century in its own Dutch silo. The overall patterns in the CRC was clear. Individual initiative developed some mechanisms which eventually were adopted by the denomination. Our boy created our thing. You see that over and over again in CRC history. The banner, the Psalter hymnal, missions, or our girl, Johanna Veenstra. These were all developed by individuals, lots of failures too, and eventually the rest of the denomination would sort of subsume some effort that was sort of doing well, and the denomination would look at it and say, oh, okay, yeah, we'll do that. Hymn singing by selected and editing hymns out of the broader church. They were brought into the church because one of the reasons the Christian Reformed Church didn't separate itself from the Reformed Church in America early on was hymn singing, only psalm singing. No lodge memberships. This is again in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Well, here this conservative by the 1920s is like, one of the first books he puts out is a hymnal. And it's not the Psalter hymnal yet, but eventually people started using this thing. This is just the same way I saw the Christian Reformed Church change in the 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts. It's just the way change happens. Here's this hymnal, and some churches start buying it, and well, it sure is nice to have some new songs. And some of these songs are, well, we got some of that Methodism sort of pushed out of it, but some of these songs are, the Presbyterians, they're not all bad. And some of these tunes are kind of nice. And Martin Luther, well, he's, a saint, so A Mighty Fortress is going to get in there. And so you have the Psalter and the hymnal, and of course, very quickly in many churches, over a period of time, psalms are hardly ever sung, and hymns are sung all the time. It really doesn't happen until after the counterculture and the biblicism of the Jesus movement that Bible songs come back into the Christian Reformed Church, but now it's contemporary music. But that's a lot later. Kuyper starts the hymns in the Christian Reformed Church. And he's a conservative, remember. The Banner replaced the Dutch magazine, and Kuyper was editor for the middle part of the 20th century. This enormous tenure as Banner editor. Dave Snapper's right. He's another guy on. I've got to get my hands on, read some of these editorial. I've got copies of my grandmother's column. My grandmother used to write for the Banner through some of those years, but I don't have anything from Kuyper's. My grandmother stopped writing sort of in the 70s. My grandparents were a generation younger than Kuyper, so about probably the age of his children. Christian schools started to take shape. Chicago and New Jersey by the 1920s already had Christian schools up to high school because they had decent-sized colonies. But Grand Rapids was sort of depending on the denomination for this prep system for preachers and Christian school teachers. And that's where the Grand Rapids Christian School Association got going. That's where Calvin College got going and the seminary. So those three institutions sort of take shape at this time. And of course, the Christian day schools are parent-run. They're not ecclesiastical. Calvin College, the one college owned by the Christian Reformed Church, and of course, Calvin Theological Seminary, another, again, a denominational seminary. And Kuyper would be around for this, to uncouple the high school from the denomination. It's as far as I'm in the book, and I'll keep reading it. Changes for conservatives. That's what's so interesting to me in this. They had to respond to the demographic growth and the challenges the broader culture forced upon them. The walls of discipline couldn't stop movies, wars, affluence, and poverty. Of course, they had to navigate the Depression in those years too. Challenges and people today sort of have their stereotype of what they were like. It was way more complex than that. They were not, they railed against socialism, but they weren't all for unfettered capitalism by any means. It was way more nuanced than any of that. Challenges in urban areas, Grand Rapids, Chicago, New Jersey, were accentuated, but many lived there before farming communities were they were poor, and in many ways second class. Pastors, even up to today, started in farming communities and hoped to move to the cities if they moved up the ministerial ladder. In order to blunt the forces of modernity, they used the tools of modernity. For the mid-20th century, that would be publications. Eventually, of course, they would get into radio. The Christian Reformed Church was not unique in this. All the religious efforts followed this track. And you look at this story and you compare it to denomination after denomination. I mean, the CRC thinks we're doing this all by ourselves, but everyone else is sort of doing it too, but with slightly different code, because these confessional codes and these religious traditions, they would shape the embrace of modernity. The idea that the medium was the message had not yet been spoken. So these were our tools. Hopefully they would be able to wield them to our ends. Now Daniel Meter is going to be in this video that I play, is a must listen to in terms of a lot of this stuff. He knows his stuff on the CRC and the RCA. I didn't know this, but my mother reminded me that his grandmother lived in the house next door. And Daniel remembers that. Daniel's a little older than I am. I should have Daniel on the channel. He's a brilliant, brilliant guy. Some of you are going to hate him because of the video I'm going to share, but don't hate people. He is who he is. He knows both groups and sees the differences. Now, also on this video, he's got two papers in the... He's got family chat making me laugh. He's got two papers in the comments here. I might as well post them here. He wrote a paper in 2023, 30 differences between the RCA and the CRC. And he just recently wrote a paper, RCA update on their General Synod. And we'll get into some of these things. The Christian Reformed Church worked to blunt worldliness through confessionalism and behavioral discipline. These roots run deep. This is why, again and again, the actions of synods 2022 to 2024 are very much CRC in style. And again, really harken back to the church 100 years ago, even though that generation would find our generation degenerate in terms of what even our conservative churches tolerate. Compared to them, the most ardent conservatives today, pretty soft. The RCA is playing a different game. Now, the RCA took a gamble. Now, the RCA, of course, came over with the Dutch in the colonial period and have always been here. And so the RCA has sort of had all of these waves of immigrants. And instead of being sort of this confessional denomination like the Christian Reformed churches, which grew to be quite a bit larger than the RCA, they're a constitutional denomination. You'll hear that in this video. Now, the RCA took a gamble during the 80s to 2020s by hoping they could grow evangelically through the seeker movement. Again, their constitutional posture, as opposed to a confessional, meant that they were able to unfold and work more effectively than the Christian Reformed Church in neo-evangelical and then seeker waves. You'd see this all the time in the RCA. They'd be able to implement these seeker ideas, and Christian Reformed pastors would try, but we just don't have the heart to go full seeker. A few pastors did better than others, but we just couldn't shake our roots. Remember, they were the closest thing to what Donald Trump had to go to church. If there's a denominational tag on Donald Trump, it's the Reformed Church in America. Keep that in mind when you watch the video I'm going to show you. That's Donald Trump's church. It is. It's crazy. But Norman Vincent Peale in New York City, power of positive thinking. The RCA, with their constitutionality, could say, you can have a power of positive thinking. And so Robert Norman Vincent Peale and Robert Schuller, who was sort of an evolution of that, but in a much more evangelical age, in a neo-evangelical period. Bill Hybels came from the Christian Reformed Church. Rick Warren came from the Southern Baptist Church, probably closer in terms of this polarity that we're looking at than the Reformed Church in America. The Reformed Church in America took in a lot of conservative evangelicals in their constitutional way. And for the part of them that was still Dutch, that was influential, the RCA was both more progressive and more fundamentalist in some ways than the CRC. When the same-sex marriage pressure got too high, it could not overcome their constitution. Listen to Meter emphasize this. And the evangelical growth left taking some of the Dutch names with them. I did a project funded by one of the DeVos, by Richard DeVos, one of the founders of Amway. He gave the Christian Reformed Church, he gave over $1 million, gave millions of dollars actually, I think, when it's all said and done, to start this little thing, this grant. I mean, you've got Shepherds for Sale. Well, his desire was to bring the CRC and the RCA back together. And so devoted millions of his dollars to it. Now it's just not even close. The Young, Restless, and Reform influence. I mean, I don't know if there was ever any Acts 29 churches in the CRC. There were Acts 29 churches in the RCA. Some of you won't know what that means, but some of you will. Mark Driscoll was part of the Acts 29 network, I believe. So you had this breadth in the RCA, and City Church, San Francisco, came over from the PCA, and they joined the RCA so they could have women in ministry. And when they came in, they swore like crazy to the class of Central California RCA that they weren't gonna move on the same-sex thing, because that was a fight in the RCA forever. And many tried to change it, but that constitutionality wouldn't budge. And so then when the RCA blew apart, well, City Church is still there, and City Classis has sort of the local option with respect to same-sex marriage. But a lot of the guys that had Dutch last names that I worked with this DeVos project, they were horrified when City Church San Francisco just kept sort of walking the thing along. The Reformed Church of America was a big deal since Schuller days, but there's not that much of it left. City Church San Francisco won their battle, but depending on how you see it, it's sort of a Pyrrhic victory. The church had almost 200,000 members this was just posted in Voices by a friend. In 2019, the Reformed Church in America had 195,000 members. This year, they have 54,000. That's a 72% loss of membership. Now, their loss of churches isn't 72%, it's about 50%. But what that means is they lost their largest churches, and they're left with a lot of small churches, a lot of which have expensive properties that they can't afford to maintain. And in the RCA, the classis owns the building, not the local church. In the Christian Reformed Church, the local church owns the building. So it's this, 72% loss of membership in 5 years. Keep that in mind when we watch the video. It's astounding. We're in the 2020s or not the 1920s. We are seeing demographic decline, not expansion. Christian schools are already evangelical, not exclusively for children of Dutch immigrants. Nobody is starting magazines. Christian celebrities far beyond us are more influential than any CRC leader could ever hope to become. Anxieties stalk us about whether the middle of the 21st century will be more bloody, destructive, or global than the 20th century was. So that's where we're at. So right now, there are so many super interesting videos on YouTube with very few views. Now, I've been pushing people to this video, so its numbers are up a little bit. But because these are just YouTube channels from Christian Reformed churches, and I've been watching a lot of the meetings that they have to explain Synod 2020, and I've been sort of paying attention to that. And then the algorithm sort of feeds me this video. Now Steve Koster is a CRC minister. His credential is held by Grace CRC. Grace CRC is in Grand Rapids, was organized in 1962. Living Stones, Sacramento Christian Reformed Church, was organized in 63. Northside Chapel, the church I grew up in. So Grace is sort of one of these racial reconciliation churches that start out of the chapel movement, and this is one of the churches that they're getting exiled. And Ryan Schreiber, he was at Synod and made quite a few speeches, so you can find him at Synod. Steve was running Reframe Ministry in the denomination for quite a while. I don't know if he still is. So Steve was ordained in 2006, charges back to God Hour still today. So he still works for the denomination. Now, part of what's been happening in the denomination is that, well, if Grace goes out, what's he going to do? Is he going to, probably have to look for a new job? Where is he going to go? So one of the options that a lot of these, I call them the exiles because they've been exiled. A lot of the exiles, they have like 2-3 years to figure out what to do. And join the RCA is one of those options. Now, the Dan Meter piece on the whole last page is sort of talks about the CRC stuff, and they talk about it in this video, and it's just fascinating to watch. So right now, these people are all very smart and they're organized and they're used to working in systems, and so they're doing their research. They got like 2-3 years to figure out what to do with their credentials, and so they're doing that work now. And of course, joining the Reformed Church of America is one of those options. So let's see, I got to figure out where to jump into this. Talked about clergy transferring. That'll be a lot of you probably not. Hang on. Now, part of what's going on is because the Reformed Church of America went from almost 2,000 to 200,000 to 50,000. They have to have a major readjustment of everything. And they used to have your congregation, your classis, regional synods, and then synods. And now they're scotching the classes and the regional synods, and now they're going to have sort of a middle assembly. And so they're having to, if you go from 200,000 to 50,000, you have to rework the whole thing. And so they're doing that right now, and probably the idea of picking up 30 or 40,000 formerly Christian Reformed church congregations sounds interesting to them. Now, the Reformed Church in America, a lot of these churches left. They sort of had a gracious separation time frame, but in order to leave the RCA with your building, you had to go to another denomination. And so this Alliance of Reformed Churches that was started by someone from the CRC and someone from the RCA sort of became a landing pad. But Freddie's calling me. Sort of became a landing pad, but the CRC thought, are we going to pick up some of these people? And so some people are hoping for that. Some conservative RCAs will join the CRC, and maybe some progressive CRCs will join the RCA. But there's a lot more to this than just that. And again, Daniel Meter is an expert on this stuff. He is super fluent in it. So I got to find where to jump in.
Yeah. Yep. And understanding. So, and I can't say that our classes has a policy of being welcoming and affirming, and Classis New Brunswick has a policy, but I don't know how many classes actually have on record as a policy that we are welcoming and affirming.
Right.
So that's...
So then, these CRCs that are leaving because the CRC sort of drew this line, and, well, is your policy going to be welcome? Is your classes going to be welcoming and affirming? And as Daniel Meter's going to say, their system works very different from the Christian Reformed Church. In the Christian Reformed Church, you're ordained, you're called by the local church, and the local church holds your credential, but that credential, in a sense, has to be approved all the way up the chain of command by classis and then by the denomination. So the CRC is way more centralized than the RCA. In the RCA, your credential is held by your classis. Your local church supervises membership. Your classis owns the building, sort of, supervises the minister, and the denomination, well, Daniel will say it in a lot of different ways.
Still a huge unknown.
Yep.
There are still congregations who are the whole inclusion piece, it was inevitable that when we're welcoming race, ethnicity, physical, mental challenges, somebody was going to say, well, what about gay people? What about queer people? And but the tenor was that pastors were asking for more time because they're working it through. And our polity allows them to work it through. And they can arrive at a decision to be welcoming and affirming, and it's up to the classes what to do with them in that regard. But there wasn't a sort of animosity or like these people are going to hell, how can you have them in? There was none of that, their sodomite stuff, which has gone on in our microphones. None of that. The pastors, really wonderful pastors in Zealand who were saying, we're talking about it. And by now, everybody has grandparents, at least grandparents, whose grandkids are gay in Zealand. And so, it's starting to make a difference. But that's still a big unknown. You might congregation might transfer into a classes or not be allowed to transfer in because it holds a different perspective.
Definitely a conversation to have up front.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think right now we're open enough about it that conversation could be had up front.
Yeah, I think so too. Because that's the tenor of the pastors who said, give us more time. Don't push this thing. Give us time. We're working on it. We're talking about it. They don't want to split their churches. Like now the CRC is going to lose churches who don't want to have to be pigeonholed, right? Where they've been able to live with the difference. Now they're going to be forced.
I'm thinking a little bit about the future in terms of trying to imagine what it would be like to have, Dan, you had said there's been a lot of change in the RCA in the last 5 years. And we touched on it briefly, but I still am interested in this topic of sort of the bringing a lot of CRC folk into the RCA, a lot of CRC folk with this deeply Kuyperian background. A lot of them are denominational leaders. They're used to running the agencies of the CRC. A lot of, high octane CRC folks, professors and whatnot. Is there a culture clash there? Is that, do you see that as an opportunity for conflict or growth or both, or just wondering what that mix would be like? Because I don't know that a lot of the CRC folks are familiar enough with the RCA to have a clear vision of what it would be like to sort of pour ourselves into the, mixing 2 buckets of paint. What color will it be when you get done? I don't know.
I can see potential for dissonance, certainly. One of the big differences is we have CRCs that have to get used to loyal. The RCA is loyal to a very firm constitutional structure with a lot of rooms and movement inside that. We trust our structure to give us a lot of room and play. And I want to go in this room now, and I want to go in that room, and so on. And these people are in that room, but we all accept it, inhabit this reformed structure. And I think for a lot of people, there's a way in which the RCA, for many people, the polity is one of the most important expressions of being reformed. That is an approach to power and responsibility.
Yeah.
So if people from the CRC can live with people strongly disagreeing with them in their own room and saying, if people from the CRC are willing to hear Kuyper being called as apartheid-loving racist, if they can tolerate that,
2 things can be true.
Now again, Daniel Meter knows the CRC, and the takes on Kuyper are, I mean, Kuyper in the CRC is like the saint. Kuyper gave us the World and Life View. Calvin College, the president of Calvin College, you know, every square inch, that was Leroy's newsletter. And I mean, Kuyper is this saint, and Daniel Meter says that. It's like, this is an amazing video.
Right? Yeah, I think it's a matter of whether CRCs can live with room for all or all one body. If I wrote this in an article recently that the CRC, the names of
the community, Daniel, if you're watching this, you need a better webcam, my friend. If you're going to do this, get a better webcam. You're I should have Daniel on the channel. We should have a conversation. But you need a better webcam.
Our LGBTQ acceptance organizations perfectly typify our two denominations. The RCA's is room for all, and the CRC's is all one body. And the CRC has always wanted to be all one body. We share the same theology, and the experience at First Christian Reformed Church, Paterson, New Jersey, is the same as First Christian Reformed Church, Grand Rapids, is the same as First Christian Reformed Church, Englewood, Illinois, as First Los Angeles, right? So, and a minister could move all one body.
He is exactly right. And this is what H.J. Kuyper put into place. And so these deep things stay in the church. It's part of the reason that RCA churches could, they do this and they do that and they do that. And CRC people be like, yeah, we'll have guitars and we'll sing with mics, but our hearts just, it's just not gonna fly like it does, because doggone it, we're just so darn CRC.
Body. The RCA has been this from the beginning, public church with room for all, and that's how come it was able to find a place for virality, because he was willing to accept the room for all as long as the structure was sound. If the CRCs can learn the disempowerment in a way of sharing a building with people who don't understand you or you don't understand, and you're going to live together and eat together, that's going to be the trick.
Now, last time I saw Daniel, it was in one of these projects that DeVos was funding, and I went to the church that he was pastoring. He's now retired. I went to the church that he was pastoring in Brooklyn, New York, this big, beautiful sanctuary, which they didn't use because it was just too doggone expensive to heat that big old building. And one of the things that they made is that we are a church of the community. You CRCs, when you're a colony church, when your people move, you move your building to go with your people. The church is sort of a function of the community. Here in the RCA, we are a parish church, and whether or not anybody from the geographic group ever goes, we sort of claim them and this community as ours, and that's our focus. And so And what's interesting, especially in this context of dread Christian nationalism, it's like, so you're saying you're the community, you're the church of people who don't even want to have a church? But it again, it's these different mindsets about what is church and how does church play with respect to an area and a territory. What is an area and a territory? It's the land. They are the church of the land. And so even if nobody goes there, you can watch First Reformed, the Schrader movie, because, there are a lot of these tensions are right there in First Reformed. Because, of course, Schrader grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. He knows a lot of this stuff. But these different mindsets and these different approaches to what is church in the Christian Reformed Church. Church is an expression of a confessional community. And the RCA church is sort of rooted in the land, and there's a little imperialism in there. And that's why, when people say, Christian nationalism, but you got to understand that the mainline ethos is imperialistic. Now, this is such a huge conversation, but, Daniel sets it up nicely.
Yeah. There will be some loss of power. There's no question about it. People who have power, I've often seen this with immigrant congregations, that people who had power in the home country don't have power in the new one. And that often causes trouble in congregations because they're trying to find they don't speak English well enough or whatever. The loss of power in immigration has to be understood and dealt with by both by the receivers as well.
So if the Christian Reformed exiles are now the marginalized because they've been exiled from their home and there's domicile and all of that, do you then give them power because they are the underclass? Oh no, they're all Dutch, so they've got to subvert their power to all of the others. I mean, it's the power. Oh, the power conversation. Oh, the power conversation.
But there's going to be pain and loss and hurt in it, and also disempowerment. Can't help it. Mm-hmm. And right now, the RCA is in a much happier place as a whole. Renee, I think you might agree with me.
We shed 72% of our people, so we're a lot happier now. There's no fights right now. We're all one big, happy, way smaller family.
That on the whole, right now, the RCA is feeling generally more positive than it has felt in years. Is that, would you say?
Joyful even.
Joyful even. Say. Yeah. So we're in a better position, I think.
And this is so funny on the Christian Reform side because, I mean, the exiles are furious. They are angry. They are in uncharted territory. They do not know how to behave. They do not know who to hate. Some of them sound absolutely Trumpist because synods were rigged. And it's like, you know who you sound like? You sound like the little boy who grew up in the Reformed Church in America. It's just insane. But yeah, it's a super live and interesting situation, and this is going to take a few years to sort of settle out, and I think it'll probably take a couple decades. I mean, the Christian Reformed Church, the last major split was the one over women in church office, and that launched the URC and some other smaller splinter denominations. And,
right now. And I want to pull out one thing from a couple things. Steve, I'm going to ask you to post a link online to the paper update, RCA update. Yep. Also, I'd like you to...
I linked that below in the notes.
Post the email addresses of two persons from RCA staff. Christina Davilar is the Chief of Operations of the General Synod staff. Laura Osborne is in charge of interreligious and ecumenical affairs. And they are going to be very...
Now, you internet troll people, don't write these people. These are fine people trying to do church work, okay? Don't write them nasty emails, please. Okay, you trolls.
They have the green light. That's the term that Christina Davilar told me. They have the green light to assist CRCs with information and guidance on needing to transfer in. A year ago, our General Secretary was hesitant about, but as of this past year, the General Secretary has given the green light to staff to be assisting to CRC congregations wanting to come in. And that,
now, to let you know how crazy small some of these things, the General Secretary is Eddie Aleman. I met Eddie Aleman. He was in this classis. He was trained by Neil Hageman, who was the most conservative missionary in the Dominican Republic when I went there. And Eddie Aleman came to Central California. He was very successful starting a bunch of church plants, I'm sure, all of which are no longer RCA. But then he was made General Secretary. And so I have no idea how any of this works. It's again, we're living in super interesting times.
That has to do with the fact that since what this General Synod confirmed has been now the recognition in print in General Synod reports, something we've already known, but has been recognized by the General Synod Council in print and in its report on restructuring. That is, in the RCA, questions of who may be a member of a church and who may be married have always been the prerogative of consistory, not of General Synod.
Yeah.
Who may be ordained and whom their congregations may marry is the prerogative of classis, not of General Synod. That has always been the case. That's how come Brooklyn and Middle Collegiate and other churches were able to operate the way they did. It's been recognized by the General Synod. It is now assumed as part of the restructuring that the denomination now, as a whole, holds to the same position that Classis North Grand Rapids and City Classis have put in paper, that both views, the traditional view and the open and affirming view, are to be honored in the church and respected.
Now it's fascinating because this was what a lot of people wanted the CRC to do, because this was the so-called local option. And that's what the Christian Forum did with respect to women in office. The difficulty, of course, is that in the Christian Forum Church, this satisfied, I'd say, 60 to 70% of the church. But many women are like, some people don't accept us. And those who don't or against women in office say, this is forced down our throats. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how this goes. And this, of course, was what the fight in the RCA was, because I had Hispanic, Asian, people with Dutch last names out here on the West Coast basically saying, if we don't stop these East Coast churches from ordaining and marrying, et cetera, we're out of here. And they did. They went. And that's, 195 to 60 or 50, I don't know what it is. That's what happened. And so now, in a sense, what happens with these fights are that the church sort of gets formed, sort of gets reformed in a way. So the Christian Reformed Church in some ways is sort of molded back more into the kind of church it was 100 years ago. And the RCA is sort of, okay, now no more they had fights, synod after synod after synod over this. No more fights about this. This is the way it is. If you don't like this, the difficulty is if you join a Christian Reformed church, you come in with your building, you can leave with your building. Even if you grow up in it with your building, you can leave with your building. The RCA, you come in and I don't know.
And neither one they're honored and respected. And individual classes will be respected for their choices, and consistory is accountable to those classes for their choices. That is now the position that the RCA has taken. So
now, mandated respect, again, we see this in Christian Reformed Church with respect to women in office. It's like mandated respect. For a long time in the CRC, and this is part of the gripe of the conservatives, if you didn't affirm women in ministry, you did not get high status denominational jobs. You did not get them. They were not coming your way. And it was on purpose. And the thinking was, well, if you're against women in office, you're going to have to work with them. We can't let you in there because you're going to have to work with women, and they might get a vibe that they're second-class citizens. And so how will this go in the RCA? I'd say probably the same way.
The General Synod paper from 1978 and subsequent papers, they represent probably the majority traditional opinion of the Holy Church Catholic throughout the world. They're going to probably stay up there because they represent the majority church, throughout the world.
In other words, the traditional language is going to stay in the papers. There's another difference between the Christian Reformed Church and the RCA. The Christian Reformed Church in its covenant of office bearers basically says these are the historical positions of the church. Do you yourself hold them? In the RCA, it says these are the historical positions of the church. Do you agree that they're the historical positions of the church? I do. Well, there you go. Now, what's interesting is that the Belhar confession was added, and Apparently, the older confessions for the RCA these are the historical confessions, but our real confession now is the Belhar. The CRC didn't make the Belhar a fourth confession. They basically adopted and said, it's a good document. You should read it. But the RCA, you'll hear Belhar, Belhar, Belhar. That's sort of their living document now.
But the point of view is that in the RCA, it's recognized now. It's in print several times since 2021. It's the prerogative of classes and histories to determine who gets ordained, who gets married, and who are members. Nobody will interfere with that.
So tell me more about the other part that came out of the General Synod, the diversity and inclusion.
It was pretty astounding, and I realized that I didn't include in my report, and therefore it's not in the report that Daniel has included in his paper, that the initiatives to change church order, our constitution, therefore, which we do submit to, although there are no police to make sure that you do it.
And this is so, see, in the Christian Reformed Church, the church order gets changed, but the confessions are sort of sticky. Seems the other way around. But that statement she just made, which we submit to, but there are no police.
Those proposals to change church order, to use this much more evidently inclusive language and being able to name people groups explicitly, came out of our African American Black Council, which is a very strong force for us since 1965. And we also have a commission on race and ethnicity. So both of these groups were bringing independent proposals. I'm sure they were consulting about them, but there was just a lot of input, proactive input coming to this General Synod from the councils and the commission. And also, I think, because I was at New Brunswick for years, and starting in the late 1970s, we began to offer evening theological education in a 5-year format. And we began to have, within a 15-year period, a preponderance of African American students at New Brunswick Seminary, not necessarily RCA. And our faculty grew in terms of race and ethnicity to be much more diverse. And at this year's synod, all of these New Brunswick Theological Seminary graduates who came to us as AME Zion, AME, Progressive Baptist, National Baptist, Pentecostals, whatever, found a home in the RCA, which they love because they've come from these kind of free and independent churches, some of them, and they see how that sort of polity doesn't work or becomes cults of personality. Oh my goodness, it made me weep actually to see all of these students from the seminary, African American and also Hispanic students, brilliant and articulate about racism and racial inclusion and why changing structures and constitution and church order and Belhar Confession has given energy to that. They can cite the Belhar now as one of our standards, and it just seemed to coalesce this year in a really powerful way in terms of kind of leadership of commissions and agencies and staffing of the RCA, like a genuinely really diverse and young, many younger people. So that piece is incredibly strong. The other thing I was thinking about in this regard, you guys have professors of theology who have a quite limited charge compared to professors of theology in the RCA. So not only are we charged for the formation of students and the oversight of their preparation, issuing these things we used to call certificates of fitness for ministry or professorial certificates. And also, your guys, I don't know if they're all guys, actually, these professors of theology, your folk also are to defend against heresies, while our professors of theology have long been understood to have also the prerogative to lead the church in its biblical and theological thinking. So at New Brunswick, the professors who were hired to teach theology were professors of...
And this is not a small difference, because she's right. I mean, if you're a professor at Calvin Seminary, you might have influence. You might, again, H.J. Kuiper had tremendous influence via the Banner, via these platforms. And in that same period of H.J. Kuiper, professors had impact, and then Calvin College professors would have a degree of status, but they had no formal position. The structure of the RCA is very different.
Systematic and constructive theology. So there's a certain authority in that office that not all people like or submit to, but I think it's made a difference for us as the faculties have been able to do progressive theological thinking, constructive theological thinking, while conserving traditions, reformed traditions and commitments through our commissions, which actually are pretty powerful in the RCA and totally volunteer.
Synod commissions. Just quickly say what a commission is.
On theology, social action, history, ethnicity, race, women,
Ecumenism.
These
are standing committees of the Synod that are volunteer and have been staffed and will continue. And they are standing committees that members sit on for like 6 years, 2 terms, and they have a lot of say. They are expected to put business on the floor of Synod every year.
They have a lot of power. They have power. And again, this is the difference between the Christian Reformed Church. You might have a synodical committee, but Synod in the Christian Reformed Church is master. And this has caused a lot of grumbling lately because, hey, you had majority votes of 3 synods. Like, yeah, no, you had like 2/3 majorities of 3 synods, and every synod since 2016 has been going this way too. But that's always the thing with the power conversation, in that somebody has it. Somebody has it. What are they doing with it? What's governing this power? What ideas? What traditions?
Huh?
Which is huge. It moves the synods to have this, and we do our best to make these commissions diverse in their membership. And often, though, they must include professors of theology. And we were responding to the work of Synod that was coming up and prepared to speak to it on the floor of Synod as delegates every year. There were 2 professors of theology. So I think that has formed us, and it's really been an important part of how we work.
So you're asking the professors and these commissions to put things on the agenda of your synod on, here's things you should be thinking about.
Yeah.
For the future of our ministry together.
Yeah.
Coming out of constructive theology.
Yeah. Awesome. So after the 1978 and 79 papers, which took the stance that, on the one hand, sexual orientation is not a chosen reality, they made the unfortunate comparison to that it's like being born with some sort of handicap.
But again, go back and watch the conversation around Born That Way right now. But because this just blew me away, because there's a ton of I mean, this is part of what's so odd about what the church is doing, in that so many people are just like, well, we're just sort of up to date on this, and it's like, yeah, Born That Way, that's really millennial right now.
That you didn't choose. That's unfortunate. But the point was to say it's not a chosen thing. Like, people don't wake up and think, oh, no, I think I'll be gay. So it's like being heterosexual. You are what you are. That on the one hand, but on the other hand, also calling for much better pastoral care of persons who are gay and lesbian, but also saying that such persons should be celibate But what happened in subsequent years is that commissions could continue that conversation through the stuff that they were saying to the synod and help develop resources so that we kept having the conversation a variety of ways. I think not terribly effective, but it could continue to come before the synod because the commissions were working, and then of course also over.
And again, this is a big part back in the, when was that? It was the teens when I was working with these projects with the RCA. I mean, this was all the stuff that a lot of these guys were talking about. They've got the commissions, and and how can we get synod to discipline these East Coast classes? And it's like, in both churches, this issue went through. And what it sort of did was make both churches. My mother would always say that when you get older, you're yourself, but more so. Well, what this fight did was make both churches what they are, but more so.
Teachers coming from classes to the synod to keep it before us. I think those two pieces, professors of theology and commissions, have helped us stay more theologically agile and open in our diversity.
Whether the CRCs come into the RCA, that's going to be, Renee and I think, speak for a lot of people who think that for the RCA would be a wonderful thing, and we think it might be very good for you, and it might be healing of. Renee's family has family stories of Renee's father could not stand up at her sister's baptism at first CRC because he was RCA. That kind of stuff. Wow. So we all have those stories, but the reconciliation is Belhar calls us for unity, reconciliation, and justice. And the RCA is really guided by Belhar in this right now, that we are trying to seek visible unity, not for the sake of our denomination, but for the sake of the credibility of the church as a whole, that people might believe. That's Belhar language, that people might believe. So unity, reconciliation, and but the justice thing is also important for us. And we believe, from what we know of CRCs, that there's a lot of passion for justice right now. That it's deep, and it's not just the injustice of Synod 2024, but what the Christian Church's mission in the world is. And if that's from a Kuyperian point of view, even a progressive Kuyperian point of view, we get that public justice. So for us, I think for a number of us, it's not just Renee and myself want this for the RCA. We want this for the church.
Yeah.
And we think we need to encourage this for the sake of the Church of Christ. And if the CRCs find out that it doesn't work for them, well, then we bless you. And how can we still help you in terms of unity, reconciliation, and justice? Yeah. If you find out that you don't like our building, our Constitution, hey, you know what? How can we still be Catholic with you?
Yeah.
That's our invitation is genuine, and it's without force.
Dan and Renee, I just want to thank you for spending this time together. This has been very helpful.
And that's it. So, yeah, it's fascinating watching this history develop. And over the next few years, it's going to be really interesting to see where it goes. So, yeah, I know this is kind of an insider baseball video, but some CRC people will watch it. Let me know what you think.